In a corner of the human heart, there lives a suspicion, an unspoken fear that our noblest impulses might be little more than a cunning disguise for something older, something primitive, something that cares nothing for our ideals. This suspicion is a shadow that has followed humankind since the first moment we dared to name ourselves conscious. And few thinkers have ever dared to pull that shadow fully into the light, as Arthur Schopenhauer did, with a severity that feels almost inhuman. To read his words is to feel a cold wind blowing through the corridors of your certainties, a reminder that the stories we tell ourselves about love, virtue, and purpose might be nothing but fragile tapestries stretched over a bottomless void. He looked at life and refused to call it a blessing. Where others saw hope and progress, he saw a kind of cosmic machinery, endlessly grinding the individual into dust so that the species could go on multiplying its reflection. He called it the will to live, a blind, ferocious appetite for existence that devours everything in its path, a will that does not reason or negotiate. It simply persists without remorse. And in this vision, man and woman became not partners in a shared journey, but instruments, each carved to serve a function in that relentless cycle. When he turned his eye to woman, he saw not a companion in the search for meaning, but the purest vessel of this will, a being shaped entirely for preservation, for continuity, for the ceaseless production of more life. She was, to his mind, not a lesser mind, but a mind more wholly committed to the agenda of nature. Where a man might be seized by a dream so vast it would devour him, some cathedral in the clouds of abstraction, a woman was rooted in the urgent facts of survival. Food on the table, safety for the child, order in the home. He did not call this evil. He called it the essence of her being, as unchangeable as the tide. But in that essence, he glimpsed a force that terrified him. Because if woman was life itself, then she was also the prison warden of his captivity. No argument, no philosophy, no act of rebellion could ever fully erase her power over the male spirit. She did not need to conquer by force. She conquered by existing, by embodying everything the will demanded of him: desire, longing, surrender. A single glance could dissolve the strongest resolve, pull a man down from the heights of his ambitions into the warm, consuming quicksand of need. He saw in the rituals of courtship and marriage not the flowering of civilization, but its most refined trap. The smiles, the soft voices, the promises of endless union, all of it to him was nature in costume, baiting the male to step into a cage gilded with romance. And when he called this a deception, it was not because he thought women were conspirators in some conscious plot. It was because he believed the will itself was the grand conspirator, using every beautiful mask to keep the game going. There is a kind of horror in this way of seeing, a horror many prefer to dismiss as bitterness. But to turn away too quickly is to miss the unsettling question hidden beneath his contempt. How much of what we call love is truly ours? How much is a reflex buried deeper than memory, an ancestral compulsion that whispers to us of passion while dragging us toward the same old outcome: birth, duty, death? Schopenhauer's own life was a testament to this conflict. His early years were shaped by a woman whose brilliance and ambition far outshone the domestic ideal of her era. His mother, Johanna, was no meek matron waiting at the hearth. She was a force of intellect, a star in Germany's literary circles, and a woman utterly unimpressed by her son's dark philosophy. Their collisions were inevitable. He saw her as shallow, performative, intoxicated by social applause. She saw him as arrogant, sullen, and pathologically incapable of joy. In their lifelong discord, you can glimpse the roots of his doctrine, not in pure intellect, but in the pain of a child who yearned for tenderness and received only cool appraisal. And so, the philosophy took shape, an iron scaffolding around a wound too raw to name. His contempt for woman's nature was, in part, a defiance of her power to hurt him. He transformed personal rejection into universal truth. He declared it law that no woman could ever transcend the petty, the personal, the instinctual. And in that declaration, he perhaps shielded himself from ever hoping otherwise. Yet even as he dismissed romantic love as a farce, he could not deny the magnitude of its force. For him, there was no seduction more total, no surrender more complete than that of a man who abandons his mission to kneel before the altar of desire. He watched this surrender unfold all around him, the philosopher silencing his own insights to please a wife, the artist discarding his genius to become a comfortable provider, the warrior trading glory for domestic peace. And each time, he saw the same truth repeated, the will to live triumphing over the will to meaning. He spoke of men who once carried a spark of something unnameable, something that transcended their animal origins. These were the men who risked everything for an idea, who carved beauty out of chaos, who pressed against the limits of their own mortality. But too often, he believed, that spark was smothered by the soft hands of intimacy. The very passions that elevated them became the chains that subdued them. It is easy to call this misogyny and close the book. It is harder and more honest to see the mirror he was holding up. Because there is a part of every man that knows the gravity of this temptation, the longing to set down the burden of striving, to dissolve into the warmth of another's approval, to trade the solitary path for the security of belonging. And there is a part that knows the price. This is why Schopenhauer's philosophy is more than an insult to womanhood. It is a challenge to manhood, a provocation to look without flinching at the cost of surrender. He believed the deepest tragedy was not that men desired women, but that they did so unthinkingly, imagining their passion was the voice of their soul, when it was merely the echo of the species whispering through their blood. Yet even in his most caustic judgments, he left room for a kind of redemption. He did not say that love must be banished, only that it must be recognized for what it is, a biological impulse that can enrich life or consume it, depending on whether it is mastered or obeyed. He spoke of the possibility, however remote, that a man could learn to love without being ruled by his longing. He imagined a kind of union that did not extinguish the self, in which two people might walk side by side without either forfeiting their separate purpose. But he warned that this union is rare because it demands a strength most are unwilling to cultivate. It requires a man to stand rooted in his own purpose so firmly that no caress, no plea, no temptation can sway him from the path he has chosen. This is the paradox Schopenhauer leaves us with, that love is both the most human of experiences and the most cunning trap nature ever devised. That woman, in her beauty and tenderness, represents both life's greatest promise and its most inescapable snare. And that a man who does not understand this duality is fated to become a stranger to himself. Drifting in the current of instincts he mistakes for destiny. Such a philosophy is not a prescription for cynicism, but an invitation to lucidity. It does not command that we renounce all intimacy. It does not demand a hermit's exile. It simply insists that before we surrender to passion, we pause long enough to ask whether we are making a choice or enacting a compulsion, whether we are giving our hearts freely or merely succumbing to the will that laughs at our illusions of freedom. To Schopenhauer, the rarest and noblest victory was not to kill desire but to hold it at a distance, to see its true face and yet remain unenslaved. In this restraint, he believed, lay the only freedom worth the name, a freedom not of circumstance, but of spirit, the freedom to look into the abyss and not look away, to love without becoming a captive, to stand in the midst of life's clamor and still hear the quiet voice that says, "You are more than this." He believed that in this act of seeing, in the simple courage to witness our own machinery without disguises, there was a peculiar dignity, perhaps even a kind of redemption. For if the will to live is an ancient tyrant, indifferent to the individual, then any moment of honest self-awareness becomes an act of quiet rebellion. It is as if, for a heartbeat, the endless cycle pauses, and the human animal remembers that it carries within it something that does not bow to the dictates of reproduction or survival. This is why he placed such value on art, on philosophy, on those pursuits that seem, to the practical mind, so utterly wasteful. Because in the making of a painting no one asked for, in the writing of a book that will not save a single life, in the contemplation of an idea that has no utility, he saw the will being denied. And in that denial, he glimpsed the possibility that suffering might be transfigured into meaning. Yet for all his reverence of the mind's higher powers, he never lost sight of how fragile they are. He knew that no cathedral of thought, no monument of reason, is immune to the simplest summons of the flesh. A single touch, a single glance, can undo years of discipline. And so, when he spoke of woman's power, it was not the crude power of domination, but the more terrifying power of awakening the ancient impulses that civilization has only barely contained. To him, the lover's whisper in the darkness is the voice of life itself, calling the man back to his oldest allegiance. And for the man who has tasted the solitude of intellectual freedom, who has built his identity on the illusion that he has transcended animal need, this call is both intoxicating and humiliating. Because it reveals how little has changed beneath the veneer of culture and philosophy. How quickly the thinker becomes the supplicant, the seeker of truth becomes the seeker of approval, the architect of systems becomes the beggar for affection. He wrote of this with a tone that is easy to mistake for scorn, but if you read closely, you sense the ache beneath it, the bitterness of a man who longed for connection, but could never trust it, who yearned for tenderness, but suspected it was always a mask for biological necessity. And so, he turned his longing into suspicion, his suspicion into doctrine. Better, he seemed to say, to remain alone than to surrender to an illusion that will inevitably devour you. Yet the irony is inescapable. Even as he proclaimed that love was only nature's trick, his own life was shaped by the hunger he condemned. His writing is full of the tension between contempt and craving. He rejected the consolations of marriage, the comforts of partnership, but he could never entirely silence the part of himself that envied them. In this, he was not so different from the rest of us, because every human being carries within a contradiction too vast to reconcile: the need to belong and the need to remain sovereign. And so, he asked the questions most dare not. What if love is not the union of souls, but the collision of appetites? What if all our vows are merely the language we wrap around instincts we scarcely understand? What if, in the final measure, our most exalted commitments are driven not by choice, but by the will to perpetuate itself through us? To sit with these questions is to feel the foundations of your identity tremble, because we do not merely want to love. We want to believe that our love makes us noble, that our devotion elevates us above the beasts. To imagine that it is all strategy and chemistry, that the poetry of the heart is only the logic of the species, is almost unbearable. And yet, Schopenhauer compels us to look there. He forces us to examine the possibility that the story we tell ourselves about romance is a fairy tale nature uses to keep the cycle unbroken. But perhaps the most disturbing implication of his philosophy is not that love is an illusion. It is that even if we know it is an illusion, we are powerless to resist it. That the will is older than reason, stronger than resolve, and perfectly capable of seducing us even when we see its hand behind the curtain. For he observed that no amount of knowledge, no volume of wisdom has ever truly liberated a man from the compulsion to chase the smile of a woman. It is this recognition that gives his writing its peculiar gravity. He does not pretend there is an escape. He does not preach an ascetic fantasy in which desire can be erased. Instead, he describes a more subtle victory, the victory of a man who, though he cannot silence his longing, refuses to be enslaved by it. A man who learns to say yes to love without imagining it is salvation. Who can feel the pull of desire and still remember that it is only one of many forces within him. In this way, his vision, though bleak, is not entirely nihilistic. It suggests that even if we are caught in the machinery of life, there remains a small space of freedom, the freedom to see clearly. And if you can see clearly, you can choose how to respond. You can let desire consume you, or you can stand with it, acknowledging its power without surrendering your soul. This is the secret he hints at, the hidden thread running through all his invective. That clarity is the nearest thing to liberation we will ever know. That, to understand your own nature, to see it in its unadorned truth, is to reclaim at least a fragment of dignity from the jaws of compulsion. But there is another side to this clarity, a cost that cannot be ignored. Because the more you understand the machinery, the harder it becomes to believe in the sweetness of the dream. The more you recognize love as a strategy, the more its tenderness seems to fade. To see the will behind every gesture, every kiss, every promise is to live in a world stripped of innocence. And for many, this is too high a price. Perhaps this is why so few have embraced Schopenhauer's conclusions. Why even those who admire his intellect often recoil from his implications. Because there is something in us that needs the illusion, that craves the story, that would rather be deceived and comforted than awake and alone. Yet he would argue that this preference is itself proof of his point, that we are creatures of appetite first, creatures of understanding only by accident, and if we want to rise above the cycle, we must first be willing to stand in its center and call it by its true name. He believed that the man who can do this, who can see the machinery without flinching, who can love without delusion, is the closest thing to a free human being that has ever existed. Not because he has transcended desire, but because he has learned to live beside it without worshiping it. This is a standard so severe that almost no one meets it, but in setting it, Schopenhauer offers a challenge that echoes across centuries. The challenge to build an inner life that is not at the mercy of longing, an integrity that can be purchased by pleasure or approval, to hold your purpose so close that even the most exquisite seduction cannot displace it. And here, in this austere demand, you can feel the sadness of a man who spent his life searching for that unshakable center and never fully found it. A man who dissected love because he could never surrender to it without fear. A man who made philosophy his fortress because no human connection felt safe enough to trust.